Well, the time change is one of the inevitable signs of spring, and now that daylight saving time is here, we are going to break down some of the history behind it and also what it means for you in terms of that extra daylight in the evening. However, the early birds have to pay a price with slightly darker mornings. Of course, that time change happened bright and early Sunday morning, and whenever you're watching this video, whether it's on YouTube or WTOL 11+, we are now well underway with daylight saving time, and we're going to break down the history and an overview of what it means for you and some signs of the spring season. Let's break into the science and talk about some of the impacts of daylight saving time and also the origins and the history of this phenomenon. First and foremost, how has it impacted our sunset time? Of course, with that loss of an hour of sleep comes some extra daylight in the evenings, and sunset time now at 7:37 after the time change. Of course, those lighter evenings are a sign of spring and eventually summer, where we get those late evenings. The price we pay, though, is in those mornings. If you're an early riser or you head into work well before 8 a.m., you are going to see more darkness in the morning with 7:51 a.m. sunrise times. There is some hope, though. By the end of March, sunset's going to be at almost 8 o'clock p.m. as we rapidly gain daylight, and our sunrise time, it is going to get back earlier again, 7:18 a.m. So even though we temporarily darken up in the morning, I promise you we are going to see some daylight before you head into work. By the end of March, it'll just take a little bit of patience. So let's compare the before and the after and what that time change means for you and your activities either before or after work. Before the time change, sunrise was at 6:52. Of course, we have lost a little bit of that daylight in the mornings now that sunrise goes to 7:51, and sunset previously was just a hair after 6:35, and now it is at 7:37 p.m. And that is, to me, the biggest impact of daylight saving time is those lighter evenings as we move forward and eventually get to those seemingly endless summer nights where sunset time is after 9 p.m. For you early birds out there, though, sunrise time at 7:51 a.m. However, the good news is we are gaining back some of that daylight at a rapid pace. In fact, we're gaining almost 3 minutes per day, and that'll be a sign of hope if you like that daylight before work. Compare that to where we were a few months ago. In early to mid-December, remember those 5 p.m. sunsets? Yeah, it was pitch black by the time you leave the office or have dinner. December 3rd all the way through 13th, we had a 10-day stretch where the sunrise time, it was at 5:03 p.m. So we've made a lot of progress since then, a sign of the spring season. We're gaining almost 3 minutes of daylight per day, and I want to show you that crescendo of daylight as we go from the start of the year in January with a little over 9 hours of daylight and push towards June. And look at that, we reach almost 15 hours of daylight. Right now, we're somewhere in between that. And of course, the spring equinox, or in other words, translation equal day, equal night, that is when we officially kick off the spring season on March 20th. And that reaches us right at that 12-hour mark, which is that second white line in the middle. June is when we reach that peak daylight, and then the latter half of the year, unfortunately, the roller coaster must go down as we lose that daylight back towards December. Now, one of the impacts of this daylight, you may have noticed this actually over the weekend. We got some snow. It is March snow, and March snow operates very differently. It melts pretty quick. Part of that has to do with the sun angle. The sun's rays are a lot more direct than they were back around Christmas time. In fact, the sun is striking the earth right now at a 47-degree angle, and this may be a bit of a throwback to geometry class or perhaps middle school math. Back in December, the sun's rays were only at a 25-degree angle. We've almost doubled that. In other words, the sun is more direct. It melts the snow more quickly. Even on an otherwise cloudy day, March snow doesn't last very long because of the sun angle. With that increasing sun angle, we are seeing snow melt more quickly, and that's a phenomenon that occurs whether it's sunny outside or cloudy outside. Even on a cloudy day, some of that sun's heat still pokes through the clouds and melts away the snow on the ground, and that's one of the reasons that on a March day, when it snows in the morning, it can kind of melt away and evaporate in the afternoon, even if it's cloudy. All right, let's talk a little bit about the history of daylight saving time, because I know this is a very controversial topic. There are some who love it, some who hate it, and everything in between. So I want to give you a few seconds to answer these questions. I'll step off screen for a second. What year was daylight saving time implemented in the United States? You history buffs may find this one interesting, and it was over a century ago. I'll give you a hint. What year was daylight saving time implemented in the United States? The answer, 1918, over a century ago. I do want to break down a little bit of the history, and 1918 may ring a bell because that occurred during the First World War. DST started originally as a wartime measure, and this might not be surprising because the time change originated as a means to conserve energy, conserve electricity, and ultimately conserve money during the war. It didn't last long, however. In 1919, it proved to be very controversial, and there was a bit of a mess in the United States government because the different branches of the government had different opinions on the time change, and a congressional override of President Woodrow Wilson's presidential veto repealed it in 1919. Only lasted 1 year. That goes to show how popular or unpopular daylight saving time was. Now, after it was repealed, there was a bit of a messy situation because a lot of cities and states, they essentially started doing their own thing. In other words, you could look at one single state, such as Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and there were numerous different clocks going on in the same state. And of course, that gets really confusing. Let's just say you live in Toledo and you work in Cleveland, there could be a totally different time within the same state. So a lot of cities and states, they started following their own clocks and their own times after daylight saving time was repealed, and that caused chaos across the country when you had a number of different times going on at once. I'll step off screen again for another quick question on some of the history of daylight saving time. Which country was the first one to enact daylight saving time? I'll give you a few seconds to answer, and I'll give you a hint. It was not the United States, although it did occur around that early 20th century time frame when daylight saving time was enacted. All right, the answer to that question is Germany. Germany was the first country to enact daylight saving time, and I want to quickly run through the history of how it started, not just in the United States, but also worldwide. Now, this might not be surprising. It was, again, you guessed it, a wartime measure. Germany was that first country to implement DST, and the purpose was to conserve electricity during World War I. Whether or not that actually occurred from the implementation, well, some scholars disagree on that. And following suit as the second country was Great Britain. They didn't want their wartime enemy to have something they didn't have, so they followed suit, and they called it summertime. Kind of interesting, isn't it? Summertime. When you think about those later evenings and later sunsets, maybe you think about summer, but a different name for daylight saving time as Great Britain implemented it in the early 20th century. All right, another quick question for you on the history of daylight saving time. True or false? Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers, was the first one to propose the idea of a time change. Oftentimes, Ben Franklin is one of the ones attributed for proposing and originating daylight saving time in the United States. However, that is a bit of a misconception. Ben Franklin was actually against daylight saving time, and way back in the 1700s, he was one of the first people to actually consider it and write about it as well. Now, Ben Franklin was very savvy and ahead of his time, and he saw the value of using the natural light from the sun as a way to adapt our work, adapt our lives, and ultimately save money and be more productive. Now, what Ben Franklin proposed was changing our sleep schedules, not actually the clocks. He wanted the clocks the same all year round, so it is a bit of a misconception that Ben Franklin was responsible for the time change. However, he proposed adapting our sleep schedules to what the sun was doing. He actually wrote a paper where he calculated the city of Paris alone could save about $200 million by using what he called the economy of sunshine, kind of another interesting name for it, but a very savvy way of looking at things and using that natural light as a way to be more productive, efficient, and ultimately save money. All right, another question for you. True or false? American farmers lobbied for the implementation of daylight saving time. Farmers have some various opinions on daylight saving time. Many of them are against it, and it is, again, a misconception. Most American farmers did not, in fact, lobby for daylight saving time. Back when it originated in the early 1900s, most farmers, they were adamantly against it, and from the farmers I've talked to today, most of them still adamantly against it. Again, they base their schedules around the sun, sort of a natural circadian way of looking at things, not what the clock was doing. And daylight saving time was actually very annoying and frustrating to the farmers early on. They had to wait an extra hour to harvest hay in the morning because with those later sunrises, the dew was still on the hay. In other words, they had to start their workday an hour later because there was still dew that they had to wait to evaporate because the times had been changed. And one last question for you. What year was permanent daylight saving time enacted? This happened in 1974. Remember how I talked about all that chaos and commotion after the 1919 repeal of daylight saving time? Well, after several decades of being on different time standards, they finally decided to make it law in 1974. And a lot of folks nowadays in the 21st century have proposed for daylight saving time to be ancient history and to just keep it the same throughout the year. I'm sure most of you watching would agree with that, but you're entitled to your opinion on daylight saving time, regardless of whether you're pro or against it. Now, one thing that the time change does tell us is that spring is almost here. And if you're watching this when the Friday it's issued, now we are just 3 days away from spring. That happens on March 20th, and that's that equinox I mentioned, where we reach that 12-hour mark of equal day, equal night, and 12 hours of sunshine. On the first day of spring, our average high temperature is going to be 50 degrees. Boy, those warmer days, don't they sound nice? Thanks for tuning in for this week's edition of Climate Friday newsletter. Now that we are inching closer to the spring season, the WTOL 11 weather team will keep you updated. If you're not already subscribed, head to WTOL.com/email, and we'll have more coming up in next week's edition.